Well, welcome everyone. Obviously, we're here on the day after a bad announcement about the shooting in Texas. And so what I thought I would do, one, I put up the Paschal Candle, which is, of course, in the church, our sign of Christ's resurrection, that all deaths are always viewed with the hope that because Christ is risen, all the dead shall be gathered into him and risen. And it's also because we've had so many shootings over the past decade. St. John's has developed a tradition that on the Sunday following a shooting, we just have a candle burning at the altar for everyone who was killed. Whether it's discussed or not, we just remember them before us. So I thought I would give you an opportunity to light candles this morning. There's one candle for each of the victims here. I'll light the first one. And I invite you to come forward and light them. And once they're all lit, you could light a couple. When they're all lit, we'll say a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Holy God, we're mindful of the irony that as we gather to discuss the spirituality of aging, there are now 21 children who will never age, whose lives have been cut short, and will not be given the dignity of this long arc of life. We ask you to receive them in your mercy and fullness and totality. And I pray for us as we continue in this life, as we consider these things, looking through these candles, that we would be mindful of a resolve to live a worthy life as those who have so far survived. That we who live in this world would be your image bearers of truth and love and oneness in the face of evil and division and pain. Amen. For those of you who are just joining us, these candles are lit in remembrance of those who have been killed yesterday. So we're going to go over a few different themes today in our lecture. You've got the notes. If you're looking online, you should be able to find some link that can also bring these notes up before you. One of the major themes of the second half of life is a deepening or a maturing self-knowledge. If in the first half of life we were building up our ego and our coping mechanisms and being somewhat self-centered, and that's okay. It's age appropriate for the first half of life to be kind of ego-driven. But like we said last week, we sometimes gather things unto ourselves that aren't our friends in the long haul, that as we're maturing, it's time to let them go. So in the second half of life, we start to question the old assumptions that we had gathered unto ourselves. Basically, we're asking, do I still believe that? Is that true? For example, just as a silly example, when Catherine was in kindergarten, she came home and she kept telling us about this boy in her class who was named One. And we thought, that's a very strange name, but she insisted that his name was One, like 1, 2, 3, 4. And it was months before she discovered his name was Juan. And if that was the case, she simply misunderstood what was being said. And at a deeper level, there are many things in this life that we have misunderstood, but we have thought were true. Second half of life might be a season to start recognizing, wait, that just wasn't true. I did not hear that right. Or another example, when I grew up, I was definitely a dog person. I loved dogs. It took me till I was about, 35 years old to realize, no, I don't. Like, dogs are fine, but they really don't add any quality to my life. My mom is a dog person. And my dad had a beloved dog named Sputnik when he was a kid he used to tell us stories about. And so I just kind of adopted their values. And after you've been out of the home for a while, you start to recognize, that's not my value. That was my parents' value. And again, there could be any number of cultural values you've just assumed were your own. And the second half of life is a time to think, is that my value or not? Or I was recently in a conversation with somebody, and he was describing what kind of employee he was, and he said, oh, I was a total drill sergeant, and I got things done. And we talked about it, and we recognized, in reality, it was effective in its way. He got things done in the workplace, but it required trampling people along the way. And he's now retired, and he was talking about it, and he thought, I realize I'm learning to let go of that. So using the language from last week, we recognize we have our coping mechanisms for the first half of life that do their job. They might not be mature, but neither were you. Second half of life, you could start, if you're paying attention, you could start to recognize that no longer needs to be true of me. So it could be things you misunderstood, things that you adopted as your own but weren't really your own, or things that were true but no longer need to be. All of these are the kind of things, as we're pursuing self-knowledge, we start to gain deeper wisdom on. And I think what could also happen in this process, especially when you have more maturity like we do in this stage of life, is you could start to look at these things about yourself that were too threatening in the first half of life to consider because you needed them to feel secure. At this season of life, as you're learning to live into the particularity of who you are and who you aren't, you might be able to do so with just a little less self-condemnation or self-judgment. I had a teacher once, he said, if you observe something, a pattern of behavior in yourself, rather than beating yourself up over it or denying it, he says you just take it out and you hold it and you say, that's interesting. As if to say, I wonder what that means. And at this season of life, you might be able to do that with things. You might respond to something the same way you always respond to it. Like every time you hear this, you always react with that and you don't even think about it. But right now you think, wait a minute, that's interesting. Why do I always have that response? And you might discover things about yourself. I recognize that what this is, it's an invitation to a new depth of honesty. After all, if God is truth, and if we are made in the image of God, and if the second season of life is helping us to live more fully into that identity as image bearers, it's only going to happen through truth. And you can be honest now in a way perhaps it wasn't safe to be honest before. And when you're seeking to be honest about these things, I don't know is an honest response if in fact the question is one that you don't know the answer to. Quite often, if we're in a process of letting go of one guise and moving on to another, there's a gap in the middle where you suddenly realize, I no longer believe this is true of me. I don't know what is true of me. And right now, I'm just in a I don't know place. And it might be this is the first season of life where that's actually permissible and safe. This could be true of theology as well. You've always believed this about Jesus and the atonement or something like that. And you don't know what you believe now. You're just in an I don't know place. That's great, because that's honest. And honest is always good. And while we're in this process of a deepening self-awareness, there is some level in which this is done in private. You know, it's you listening to your soul, beginning to ask dangerous questions you've never asked before, beginning to wonder about things. And there is a complexity to who you are that no one else in the world knows. You're just this huge repository of everything you've experienced in your life has helped form who you are. No one has access to that whole except yourself, even if it's in your subconscious. So this kind of work of self-awareness on one level is a very private, solitary affair. But it is also something that is done in community. I think that you can invite honest feedback to specific questions from people you trust. I had a dream 2 nights ago with Brad Pitt. I don't know what this says. You could work out whatever subconscious issues your rector has. Brad Pitt and I were in this dream together, and I said to him, I've begun to wonder lately if I think it was something like, do I always put myself as the center of attention in a conversation? And he looked at me, Brad did, and said, about 25% of the time. And I thought, that's good to know. Brad and I were very close friends. In this dream, he was allowed to be honest, and I could hear it with my defenses down. Now, I don't actually think I always put myself in the center of every conversation. You might tell me differently after this lecture, but in the dream, it was an exact example of what I'm talking about here. If it's someone you know and trust, you're trying to understand yourself more fully, although you're the only one who has the full complex picture of yourself within yourself. Those people who know us well could often actually see things we can't see. And if you could trust them with an honest question, and you tell them why you're asking this question, because generally people just say, oh no, you never do that, sugar, you're lovely. If you say, no, I'm really trying to understand myself, and I invite an honest answer, you could ask, and it's okay. So another aspect of how do I gain self-awareness is actually just utilizing a lot of well-developed tools that are out there in this world. I'm just going to list some of them. In every case, it's in your notes, and I tell you where you could go for more information, because this isn't a seminar on using all these tools. It's just to say our species has developed a lot of wisdom and knowledge, and we don't need to recreate the wheel. And so most people I know who have done good work on developing self-awareness of who they are and how they function have used some or all of these tools, plus others. The first one is family systems theory. This is a fascinating study that recognizes generational systems within families tend to repeat themselves. That each generation has someone who plays this role, has someone who plays this role. There's a way of relating with one another. It's uncanny how much passes through the generations. And they use something called a genogram, which is something like a family tree, but it's not just your birth date and who came from who. It's a way of tracing all sorts of different patterns of relating and careers and mental health issues. And by filling out this genogram, you could start to see these patterns that repeat generationally, and you could recognize, oh my gosh, I totally function in that role. I've done a lot of work on this, and there's many ways I absolutely became my stepmother. The role she has in our family system, she has a unique place in our family system, and I have the exact same permission and role in my generation in ways that no one else does. I actually have done a lot of this work with my siblings, and together we've filled out these genograms and discussed things and whatnot. It's super helpful. You'll see in your notes there's a workbook you could use that kind of walks you through it. So that's one source. The second is Myers-Briggs. Many of you might have done this in a professional setting. With Myers-Briggs, they break human personalities into 16 different types, and it's known by 4 different letters. What it does is it recognizes in our human psyche, there are 4 trajectories. There's not a right or a wrong, like, are you an extrovert or an introvert? And they define what this means. It's not just, are you outgoing or shy? So you're somewhere on the scale between extroversion and introversion, and there's 4 kind of scales like that. And all you do, you could go online, you could find a free test. I've put one down there for you if you just want to take a quick test. And it will come out with this 4-letter code. I'm an ENFP. And then you could look at ENFPs, and it's uncanny. You think, oh yeah, that's exactly how I function. And then you read other people's, and you realize, oh yeah, that's totally not how I function, but my brother is definitely one of those. And what's nice about it is there's no judgment in it saying it's better to be this versus this, or you're striving to become that. It's just this recognition of my personality type functions in this way. And when I'm in a relationship with other people, when you're young and immature and in that first half of life stage, you tend to think the way I function or I perceive things is the right way of functioning and seeing things, and all the world should if they have good sense. As you get older, you recognize, oh no, not everyone functions like me, and it's a good thing they don't. Because the world is actually healthier when people function differently. I'm just going to point out Linda Brune right there. She was my senior warden for 2 years and was one of the capital campaign co-chairs. One of the trajectories is J versus P. J is someone, they want to make a plan on the front end, gather the data, make a plan, stick the plan, and go with it. A P wants to keep collecting data way up until the last minute before making your decision, and you can be totally flexible with that as well. I'm a total P. Linda's a total J. Working in an organization's a lot better if you have Js. Because it's clearer for everyone to understand this is the system we're working with. And so as the rector, knowing that I'm a P, I'm attracted to other leaders who are Js because I know they will balance me out. And so that's part of the benefit of this kind of self-awareness, is saying, I know now how I function. I know it is irritating for my employees when I'm totally functioning like a P. We would be better off using their skills as a J, which is why a lot of workplaces use this Myers-Briggs. But in terms of families, it's also marvelously helpful to understand, oh, you function like this for this reason, and I function like this for this reason. And it gives you just a lot of grace as well. Like, I recognize when I'm functioning like a P, it's normally when I'm getting really stressed. And it's kind of a signal for me, so it's some good self-awareness. The next one I'll point out, I skipped one, is the Enneagram. This is also a personality type indicator. It's actually a very ancient source. No one really knows where it came from. There's theories on it, but it goes way back to Middle Ages and beyond. This one recognizes 9 personality types, and each one is just numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The best way to do this is I've recommended a book, I believe. Richard Rohr, he's a current Christian author and thinker. He's written a very good book on the Enneagram, a Christian perspective, and his advice is you just read through all the types. You'll identify with all of them to some degree or another, but typically there's one where you go, thunk, that's me. I'm a 4. I laughed and laughed when I read it. I would call my brother and say, listen to this, and we would laugh because it was describing me to a T. And again, part of the wisdom in this is recognizing you're always going to be a 4, in my case. Now, you could be an immature 4 or a mature 4, but you're never going to be a 7. And it's okay to function in the type that you are. Other people read this and it just doesn't, they don't really sink in with any of it. Cynthia's read it and she goes, yeah, I just don't know. And it's true, when I read them through, I think, yeah, Cynthia, nothing defines you as well. Other people, it's self-evident. And one of the things I love about the Enneagram is that it identifies for each number what your root sin is, or what your root temptation is. Like, what's that thing that you will naturally gravitate to when you're not doing well? And for a number 4, it's envy. And I remember when I read it and I thought, of course. Of course that's what it is. It took all these things I've struggled with over my whole life, and I recognized that there's one umbrella category, it's envy. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to stop being envious, but now when I am, I at least see it for what it is. Like, oh, you're functioning to your type. Still your choice, are you going to respond in a mature way or an immature way? But the fact that you're struggling with it makes all the sense in the world, and it gives you a lot of grace on yourself. So again, I would recommend that book by Richard Rohr. And then my final thought is just simply good old-fashioned therapy. You do not need to be in a crisis to visit a therapist. If you were to call a therapist and say, I'm just at a season of my life where I want to understand myself better. I'm in these relationships, I still would live with my wife or my grandchildren or whatever. I want to be the healthiest me I could be. That would be great. Not all therapists are of equal quality, and generally it takes a few sessions to think, is there resonance or not? Like when I talk, do I feel like I'm heard or understood? Is my therapist responding in ways that are bringing light and hope, or is it just frustrating and we feel like we're at cross purposes? Try another one. But a good therapist, their job is just to help you understand yourself. And just like you would go to a medical doctor for physical problems, you go to a therapist for personality issues because they're trained and skilled, or at least they should be. Gail and I were talking about this the other day. Not all therapists are great. But the idea is there are people who have gifts and training who could just help you understand yourself. And this is our goal. In this life, we want to reach the end having matured into the best version of ourselves we could be. We as Christians use the language of the imago Dei. We're made in the image of God. All of us have struggled to live into that identity. All of us have sinned and been sinned against, and we have been damaged and wounded. But we have been given this life. I don't know what's on the other side of the grave. I don't know what form resurrection and redemption will take there, but we are accountable for this side. And to be the healthiest version, as Christians, the ones who have been most transformed by God's love and grace. That's our goal. And all these sources could help with that. And I don't think it comes as any surprise to any of you that if you are doing this kind of work on self-knowledge and understanding who am I, why do I behave the way I do, you're not going to get very far into this work before you're starting to pay attention to your family of origin. Guaranteed. And the first source of that family of origin is, of course, our parents. They are the ones from whom we came. Literally, we are the sperm and the egg joined together. We have no existence physically without them. You were nurtured in your mother's womb for 9 months, feeding on what passed through her body, knowing the rhythm of her heartbeat and her voice. Your earliest formative things all came from your parents. I remember when Henry was a little baby, they say they could only see like 15 inches at, when they're first born or whatever the number is. I don't know what it is specifically. But I remember when Henry was at that newborn stage and holding him in my arms and having this sense of, I am your universe. Like at this moment, like my physical embrace is your whole world. And what an extraordinary responsibility and dignity it was that I have been asked to be a steward to this life. That who I am, who Cynthia is, this home we're creating is going to be the context of this child's earliest formative structure. It's a great dignity, it's a great responsibility, and of course, in one way or another, we were all damaged by that structure because we all had parents who were sinners, because we're all broken in various ways, which isn't to say that their love isn't real, it is. But we have been formed by that, and when we're trying to understand who we are, the work will generally take us back to those earliest relationships. And my theory is that what we do is with every experience we have, every hour of every day, we are building frameworks of understanding and making sense of this world. Through what we experience, it's like it's creating a framework, a structure that is our interpretation of what this world is and what our place is in it. And whether that structure is true or false, it becomes the initial structure, and then each subsequent experience is building onto that. Sometimes there's bits of it that get ripped down, but generally we just keep building up. So even if we can't remember the first 3 years of our life, those were the years when we were first establishing this worldview of what it is and how we belong in it. And the later half of life, when we're doing this work of a deepening self-awareness, it's time to start looking at that again. That's why, the Enneagram, the Myers-Briggs, the family systems, it's all helpful because now as adults, we could look at it again. All those things we just took for granted, for the first time perhaps, we could say, that's interesting. Turns out I don't like dogs, or whatever. What does that mean? And I think kind of the stereotypes we have about mother or father and their significance, I think there's some reality to it. Not exclusively, but the idea that mother is kind of this eternal icon of the mother bear who nurtures and protects and provides, lays her life down for her young. Not all of us had mothers like that, but I think there's something hardwired into it, be it from our species or by our culture, that has an expectation that the mother is that kind of forever nurturing, protective character. Likewise, that the father is forever this providing, strong, safe character. Many people recognize that one's relationship to their father almost always translates into how you perceive God. Now, these are very gendered roles, and it could be especially in this era when we're broadening our understanding of the complexity of gender, that this kind of language might not hold out for generations to come. But certainly in the era in which we were all raised, these stereotypes have some merit, whether they were true in your families or not. But even when they weren't true, that could be just as formative. If you had a mother who was anything but nurturing, she was an alcoholic, she was out, running around, she criticized you all the time and told you were ugly. It's this absolutely contrary view to what a healthy raising requires. And so who you are now is someone who was formed with this kind of anti-mother character. And we'll talk about forgiveness and such later on. But at this stage, it's worth recognizing just how pivotal those parent relationships are. I think the other thing that most people recognize as we age and we consider our childhood is how much we start to gravitate back towards that actual kind of geography of where we were raised. I know for myself, I can just see a picture in a magazine for a Honda, advertisement, and I know intuitively if that picture is from Northern California. I know the shape of the hills, I know what the light is like and how the trees grow in the shadows in the valleys. I just know it because that's where I was raised. I have another friend, he's same age as me. He nearly died last fall from some freak medical circumstance. He was hospitalized for weeks. He recovered and survived, but in a subsequent conversation, detached from the near-death conversation, he was saying, lately I have just had this yearning to go home to Cayucas. And that's the town he was raised in. And we explored it some more and thought, that makes sense. We've been through this season of crisis with COVID and what's happening politically. He'd had a near-death experience. He's at this middle-aged, 50 years old point, and there was just this intuitive yearning to go back home. And I think to one degree or another, many of us start to feel this more and more. You might not literally go home, but there's just this sensibility of origin to which you still belong. And as we're trying to age into this season of life, it's worth paying attention to that and to ask the question, what does it mean? What does it mean that I identify so much with the geography? And I'm sure many of you have been around seniors who are entering into dementia, and they'll keep kind of rehashing the same old stories. Oftentimes they go way back to their childhood. It's a very familiar phenomena. And one of the way experts have understood this is they call it the life review process. So that story that keeps getting recycled, there is some natural sense in which you're trying to make sense of it. Or that story itself has become iconic for a larger theme in your life. And by repeating it over and over, the subconscious is trying to kind of reconcile what it means and also to work out your sense of self that's rooted into that season of your life. You'll also see with people who are quite far into dementia how they start talking about their mother again. You know, I think it's more often the mother than the father. It gets back to this stereotype of, mama is just the nurturing one. She's the one I'm safe with. But again, the fact that this happens so regularly suggests that there is something just primal in who we are in relationship with that family of origin we experienced when we were very young. And it's worth paying attention to. And like I say, if what we're doing is trying to process that or integrate that experience with who we know ourselves to be now as maturing people, odds are to some degree there's going to be some need of reconciliation and forgiveness. That is this pivotal theme of the gospel, and as we're people of faith looking at the spirituality of aging, it is worth looking at what these meta-themes are with Jesus and saying, so how does that fit into this process? And for Jesus, forgiveness is absolutely this pivotal issue of the kingdom of God, and we will probably need to forgive. But we'll talk about that later. So in conclusion to this section, this is all to say that this sense of reconciling who you now know yourself to be with who you have been in the first half of life in your childhood, this must matter. This must be important work. One, because God made us this way. Kind of the arc of this human experience we're having is calling it forth from us. And as people who are taking it seriously, we choose to pay more attention, and we trust that God wants us to. That for whatever reason, God has us live this life in this arc as we're living it. So if God values the process, we must value the process. And it might be that you think it's just too overwhelming. It's too much, or it's too hard, or there's too much I don't know. Peace. If God is with us, God is with us. What we get is what we get. And I heard a Chinese proverb just the other day that said, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. It might have been better to start on some of this work 20 years ago. Okay, if you didn't, you're alive today. So carry on with seeking the best self-knowledge you can and who you are and who you are not and why you function the way you do. I'm going to try and break us into more frequent conversations this time. Today's lecture is in 3 sections, so that concludes our first section. Are there any questions or comments for me before we break into groups? Jeff?
You said we lie to ourselves. We hide things from ourselves. We lie to, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, we lie to ourselves. We have to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Carol?
Many years ago, some of you may remember the EST seminars. I attend several of them, and the one that came back is kind of a corollary of that, is we make ourselves right.
Yeah.
If you say something and someone refutes it, then you create a way to make yourself right.
That's right. Yeah, it's a very much a first half of life behavior that we feel secure and safe in this world if we can be right. It's very selfish and inward looking because it's not actually looking for truth and it's certainly not looking for relationship. It's looking for your prominence. Second half of life is actually interested, what is right? Who am I and who are you and what are you saying? And you actually have value too. So what I'd like you to do, just break into partners and discuss this question. It's written in your notes. What occasion or methodology has fostered your strongest experience of self-knowledge? So occasion would be, at this moment when this event happened, it was suddenly, the scales fell off my eyes and I perceived truth at a deeper level. Or methodology might be, I did go to therapy, or I did do the Enneagram and it was really revealing to me. So 5 minutes, so that gives 2.5 minutes per person, and I will tell you when you're at the 2.5 minute part. Okay? All right, if one person has been talking the whole time, now would be a gracious time to switch. All right, let's gather back together. Let's try it the Episcopal way. The Lord be with you. There we go. All right. So the first half of this, our family of origin played a big part in how we're understanding ourselves in this second half of life. But the other family issue is, who is our living family now? What is our relationship like with our family members at this season of our life? And I think for many of us, this is one of the strongest, most driving forces in this season. And I think there's just something very natural about this. How many of you moved to Gig Harbor because you had family nearby? Like, actually, in this case, just one that I'm aware of. But there are 2, 3, 4, okay, and in the church, there's many. Grandparents moved to be near their grandchildren, or people moved to be near their siblings. They are just these natural, intuitive relationships. And that's okay. You know, Jesus might be calling us to this kind of universal sense of kinship with all creation, and I actually believe that's true. But along the way, the more natural, easier, intuitive sense is, who's my immediate family? And that's great. In fact, Jesus doesn't criticize that kind of behavior. There's a point where the Pharisees are trying to snag him on something, and he turns around and goes, yeah, well, you're giving all your money to all these spiritual causes, ignoring your parents, you hypocrites, and shut them up. You know, like, there's just this intuitive sense that a son should take care of his aging parents. The end. Likewise, when Jesus is dying on the cross, what's one of the last things he does? He forgives, but when speaking to presumably John, here is your mother, pointing to Mary. Mary, here is your son. Like, his last gesture is making sure that his mother's taken care of. There is just this intuitive sense that God has given us family. And I actually think this is quite a significant theme that's worth pausing and studying. In fact, you might recognize that when I went on sabbatical last year, that was the sabbatical theme. Who do we know ourselves to be through the context of our families? Other relationships, they come and go. The families that you were born to are yours for life. Even if there is estrangement with someone who has not been active in the family for 20 years, their very absence is still an important matter to your family system. And I have this sense that God said, yes, you are part of all creation. Yes, a deepening spirituality will find that kind of kinship. But I am giving each of you a family. And these are going to be the prominent relationships in which you love, in which you are formed, in which you experiment with grace through forgiveness, through which you know yourself. This is the family. This is the community I give you for life. It's a permanent community where we are known and we know, where we are cared for and we care. And I would say that it's in our families that we experience intimately the ontological reality of our corporate experience. Ontological refers to kind of that method of study of beingness, like who I know myself to be. And we said in the lecture last week that it's easy to know ourselves as individuals. It's a little more difficult to know ourselves as a corporate entity. But I believe that is our deeper reality that's just as true as our individual one. It's sin and brokenness that cuts us off, which leaves us rendered as solitary. But the reality is we are not, and I think families are the way we are most apt to know this sense of oneness. That's why the language in Genesis, when Adam marries Eve, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, it's physically this kind of sense of oneness. I was watching a documentary last night on fungi, and it was fascinating, let me tell you. But it was describing, what's it called, the little threads that run into the soil? Mycelia are those little threads that run under the earth. And there are scientists who are thinking that mycelia is both physically and symbolically, but they were leaning on the physically, this interconnected web of all being. that there is more fungi than any other kind of creation. Every step you take, they say you are walking over 300 miles of mycelia, all these little threads, that everything is connected. It was a great documentary. However, I think families are like mycelia. They are this sense where we know most our interconnectedness. And I think it's interesting that these families do grow over the years. You do get married and someone is grafted in. You receive a step-parent who now becomes part of that family. You have children and grandchildren. I might have shared with you, I had this powerful experience at my niece's wedding in February where my sister-in-law's parents were walked down as the grandparents of the bride and seated on our side of the aisle. They were the other family. Like when my brother got married, our family was on this side of the aisle, they were on that side of the aisle, but now a generation down, we're the family. And it became true. Mike and Jen became one flesh, and now Dick and Carla, her parents, sit on our side of the aisle. Our sense of being a family, it isn't static. It does enlarge, but what I don't think it does is shrink. People die, people may be estranged, but they remain part of that family identity, always. And I think one of the important things for us to consider, and I believe it's overlooked culturally, is the value of siblings, especially when we become adults. By the time we reach, I'm 51, you're up through your 80s, there are next to no people in our lives who knew us as children. In the odd case, you have friends from kindergarten, but that's not normal. It's good, it's just not frequent. In most cases, the only people in our adult lives who know us from childhood are our siblings. And not only did they know us, they were formed in the same context, which isn't to say they had the same experience. Your sister's relationship with your mother might have been wildly different than your relationship with your mother. But you were both raised in that same family system. And as we get to our age, there's no one left who knows that. And one of the sorrows of estrangement between siblings is the estrangement that person who ought to be this kind of intimate companion because we were formed in the same thing is no longer there to share it with me. That's Cynthia's experience with her brother. They just can't connect. And both her parents are dead. All that's left is this brother, but she doesn't even have him. And it's this deep sorrow. I'm aware, I had this memory of my sister and I. We were in elementary school, and there was a hill in our backyard with English ivy growing on it. And it was summer, and it was warm, and it was nighttime, and we were lying in the ivy, looking up at the stars, and it was just this elemental moment of knowing ourselves as part of this universe, and we were experiencing it together. And I'm aware that if Jill should precede me in death, part of my grief will be I now share that memory alone. That bereavement is that solitariness of our memories as well. And our siblings just have this unique role in our lives of sharing that heritage and knowing us through every stage. With Cynthia, I love her. I have heard lots of stories about her childhood. I will never share those memories. I only know them secondhand. Only the siblings, in most cases, share them. And I would say now, I'm fortunate. Probably my two closest relationships are my two brothers, the ones I am most apt to turn to for understanding and solidarity and companionship of kind of this ongoing sense of who I am. Doing the family systems work with my siblings was extraordinarily rich and has helped me immensely in knowing who I am. And the next thing I want to talk about in our living families right now is the role of being matriarch and patriarch. These aren't terms that we use much in our culture, but for the sake of this lecture, I thought they might be worth reviving. So everything you're hearing me say is just me thinking. This isn't based on any authority. This is my thoughts on these old terms. And my understanding of matriarch and patriarch, that their principal job in the family is to be those who bless. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Once we get to kind of this half of life, if nature is working its way right on us, and we are getting past kind of the ego stage, and for those of us who were parents, we became parents typically when we were young, and we were young and immature and didn't really know what we were doing, and that's okay because that's the way God made it. I mean, we could start having babies at 14, for God's sake. It's reasonable to think that we're going to be immature when we're doing it. That's the natural way. But what that means is, one, when you're parents of young children, it is unrelenting, and you are tired. You're totally inexperienced. You don't know what you're doing. You feel the weight of responsibility for their well-being in formation. I remembered at an early age, yes, I'm Henry's universe, and that was this lovely moment, but at the same time thinking, Jesus, I'm going to need you to heal my son from the damage I will do to him based on the fact that I'm a broken person. There's no way that my weaknesses aren't going to infect him in their way. So Jesus, I'm going to need you to be his redeemer as well. And of course, there's also the issue that we are unconsciously working out our own mess through them. The mother who never felt pretty, who's desperate to make her daughter pretty, that's her issues. She hasn't thought it through. She doesn't understand it, but it's being worked on their children. So all of that's inevitable in our early parenting years. But then we enter into a season where we start to become grandparents, and we enter into these matriarch and patriarch roles. I think it's worth saying, aunts and uncles actually can already function as grandparents even a little sooner. Because the aunts and the uncles don't have all those burdens that the parents carry, they could have a unique relationship with their nieces and nephews that are providing the kind of blessing I'm about to talk about. When you reach the grandparent age, when you're the patriarch, when you are beginning to see my vocation is now to be the one who blesses, what you're doing is helping that grandchild or niece or nephew to have this anchored relationship in the world. They know of you, that their relationship with you is secure, that you are there for them and you love them. You desire their good. You're no longer burdened with the responsibility of raising them. For all those things that we listed before, that's just not the season of life you're in anymore. You can simply be present to those grandchildren or nieces or nephews as the one who loves them and is glad they're there. We've got a next-door neighbor, a little 4-year-old boy, and in some ways, Cynthia and I function in a grandparenting kind of role with him. Cynthia works from home now. Hollis comes over to visit often. It does not matter how busy Cynthia is at her desk. When Hollis comes in the room, she stops what she's doing, she pivots the chair around, she gets down on his level, and Hollis knows he belongs there and he is adored. He has no conception of what he's interrupting because she chooses not to have that posture with him. And they have the little routine. They go through the stapler, he goes and gets water, all these little things they do at her desk together. And he's there for, 5-7 minutes, and then he's off to do whatever next adventure there is. The other day, he and his dad and I were working on a project in his yard, and Hollis was trying to help and totally in the way. And the father kind of and finally took him and kind of dropped him in the house for the mother to do. And I could see his countenance crash. He was just a boy out there with his dad wanting to help, but the dad was focused on, because there's time, we've got to get this done, and da-da-da-da-da. And later that day, I went over and said, "Hey, Hollis, I'm doing something. Can you come help me?" "Yeah, I just made something up. It wasn't something I was really doing. I just wanted to let him drill a hole." So we went out in the garage and drilled a hole. It was kind of this grandfatherly thing. It wasn't about the project. It was all about Hollis being able to work alongside his dad or his grandpa. Just this presence that says, "I see you and I desire your good." Part of what's happening at this point is with your children, or when you're young, your children are an extension of yourself and they're an extension of your ego. When I was a young rector and my children misbehaved at church, I hated it because what did it say about me? What kind of dad was I if they weren't these perfectly behaved children? Cynthia just reminded me of this the other day, and I got super defensive, and I had to do my breathing exercises. She quoted me, and I was horrified that she remembered this to be able to quote it. I'd totally forgotten, and I thought, yeah, I think I did say that. Because they're an extension of me. I'm a young rector who's insecure in his position, who wants to be strong and capable and respected, and my children were undermining it, or at least I perceived them to be undermining it. You get to the grandparent stage, and they are no longer an extension of you in the same way your children were. And one thing I think that's worth saying, especially in this generation, is if you have this mindset, my job is to bless them. My job is for them to know they are safe with me. I think statistically it is very unlikely that this room will be free of people whose grandchildren identify somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. And let me just tell you this. If your kid is identifying as trans or something like that, just bless them. You don't need to be anxious about it. Guaranteed the children are anxious. Guaranteed their parents are anxious. There are plenty of people being anxious about them as they're trying to work out their gender identity. All you have to do is bless them. To be this presence in their world that says, regardless of what I'm going through, I know she loves me and I am safe. It doesn't matter what color nail polish I'm wearing or what I'm choosing to do with my hair. She always welcomes me. Because the truth of the matter is, you are now free because it's not about you. It's just not about you. I might have told you this story when I was a chaplain in the hospital. And my big pivot point, this is when I was training to be ordained. And you know, when I first started going into hospital rooms with these strangers, and what am I going to say, and am I going to have the wise words, and what if they have a burn on their face, because I can't handle that. Skin issues freak me out. And there was one point I realized, Eric, it's not about you. You're free. You don't have to worry about having the wise words or having it all figured out. And it's the same kind of thing with your grandchildren. You don't have to figure them out. You just need to love them. Which means you get to be the anchor. You're not the center, they're the center, but you get to be the foundation of this stable world they live in. So another aspect of blessing, how do we bless as these matriarchs and patriarchs, is that we get to start letting go of things. This is actually going to be a major theme in next week's lecture, but there's a preview this week on letting go. And right now it's the very idea of letting go as a part of blessing. This is what you're letting go of. One, you're letting go of being in control and having to manipulate the situation. You're not responsible for them. Another way you're having to let go, and we'll talk more about this later too, is being in control of your own circumstances. In most cases, as we age, there comes a point where our adult children need to start coming in and making decisions on our behalf, and we all know how awful that is. We've all experienced it with our own parents, and we've observed it happening in our friends and how much resistance there is. But when we start to decline and can't make decisions responsibly, or we can't remember the decisions we've made, when we are now unsafe with driving or paying our bills, we need to trust our kids, if the family's working all right, to be able to step in and start taking that control. But if for the whole second half of life you've already begun fostering this, I'm now in a season of letting go, and it's becoming true of who you are in your person, when you reach that point, which none of you are at right now, but you'll get there, when you reach that point, already you've been fostering this letting go-ness of control, and it'll make the process a lot healthier. You're also letting go of being the center. In most of our ego-driven first half of lives, in one way or another, we're always trying to position ourselves as the center of most situations. We want control, we want our story to be the funniest, we want to be the most capable one at work. Whatever our strength is, we're going to have this sense of, that's my identity. But as you're entering into this thing where later half of life, you think, I don't need to be the center anymore. The more I become other-centered, the more I begin actually to value and see the goodness and the distinctiveness of the other person, the more I want to bless you with it. A friend of mine named Rita, she told this story of, she was in a boutique with her daughter, and Rita was probably 60 at the time, so her daughter was, 30, and the daughter was trying on this beautiful dress, and the shopkeeper looked at Rita and said, oh, and the daughter was beautiful with this great figure. She was kind of like modeled pretty. And the shopkeeper looked at Rita and said, oh, aren't you just so envious? And Rita responded, oh, darling, we had our turn. And it was totally letting go. She was delighted to watch her beautiful daughter try on a beautiful dress. And Rita now had a thicker waist and bigger hips, and she had her turn. And now it was the season just to delight in her daughter having her turn, who will also age, and then the granddaughter will have her turn. Oh, darling, we had our turn. I think we also begin to let go of our money and our possessions. Well, again, we'll talk more about this later. But there is a season for building up, of developing financial security and stability. And for many people, second half of life is a recognition, I'm now living more modestly. And what that's allowing me to do is to bless. I have these things I no longer need to hoard for myself, for my reputation or my security. I could have a modest life. I'm okay. And look what I have to bless with. I think you could start being more modest too in all those kind of self-serving priorities and pamperings you've chosen in the first half of life. I think of people who love to travel and to recognize, of course, traveling's delightful. I love it. I can't imagine ever wanting to stop. And yet, I think there comes a season that says, I don't have to keep on spending all these resources on my own exciting experiences abroad. And I think what you can do is begin to recognize, how can I give that to other people? You know, again, the most obvious tier is your immediate circle. Lucy Sharp, that used to be her sculpture. She died. She gave it to us. She and her husband had a lot of wealth, and part of what they did with it, with each of their grandchildren, I think when they turned 14, that grandchild could say anywhere they wanted to go in the world, and the grandparents took them on that trip. Now, obviously, that's a privilege of wealth, but they had it. But what they were able to do in that system is to have this one pivotal, special moment with their grandchild that would be theirs forever. Especially, talking about this blessing, knowing your grandparents are there for you, they were able to use that to say, how can we give you this experience you daydream of, and we're going to do it together. As you're transitioning into becoming an adult, that transition's going to involve this intimate time together. So it's obvious the first tier to whom you could be generous is your immediate family, but especially as we begin to think towards our broader community, getting deepening kingdom of God values, you might consider using the traveling example, are there people in your church who are poor, who will never have a real vacation? It's just not an option. What if you were to say, I would like to fund a vacation? I don't know how to manage it. It's just the concept that says I could start living more modestly so that I could bless. And then the last thing I want to discuss about in terms of letting go is the dangerous one, and that's secrets. Secrets. Most families have a whole host of skeletons living in their closets. And what these family secrets do is they are a powerful source of control and manipulation about what is permissible and what is not permissible. There are things that could never be said. Incest is probably the biggest one. It's kind of the last taboo in our culture, such that you never even hear about it. But statistically, there's a massive amount of incest happening in this world. And it makes sense. It happens, both men and women do it, probably more so men than women. Our energy is often a sexual energy, and it's power and control, and it is easy to use that sexual energy on a weak, vulnerable member of the family because you have control to shut them up. There are all sorts of ways to keep the secret. So you're working out whatever brokenness is in you through this sick sin against the children. And the children are shaped by this, and it can never be discussed. I was in a family systems class, and there were probably 16 of us. We all did times of sharing our story. A quarter of the stories were about incest. Both mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, uncles, aunts. It's actually quite prevalent. I only use that to say how powerful these secrets are. And typically what happens, it doesn't have to be incest. I use that as a horrible example. There are any number of secrets that the family keeps. The first marriage that ended in divorce, or the illegitimate child, DNA testing is revealing there's all number of half-children out there who were never admitted to. But what happens is there's no such thing as a real secret, because the process of covering up that shame becomes this force in the family system. And the child being raised in it, they feel the source, they feel the force, they feel this is dangerous, I'm not allowed to go there, something just happened. They never know what's behind it. And in some ways, there's just absolutely no way you could find it out. And so you end up being raised in an environment, misinterpreting what you're intuitively feeling, and then you're being formed by that misinterpretation, that there is this danger. And I think part of the role of patriarchs and matriarchs is to be truth tellers. But understand, it's not a time to go out and shame people or throw people under the bus, but especially with younger generations, they have the right to know the truth of their family. I remember Catherine was maybe, 14 years old. She and I were going on a camping trip together, and it was just one of those things. We were having this drive, and it was me telling her more of the stories about our family. Because like all families, there's brokenness. There's alcoholism, there's abuse, there's suicide attempts. All of that is being thrown into the hopper of making our family systems. All of us are being raised in response to that. And as kids are coming of age, when it is age appropriate, they have the right to know. I remember being 18 years old, driving through the night to the mental hospital to visit my grandmother, who had suffered significantly in this life. And I knew that growing up, but it was on that drive at 18 years old that my dad started telling me stories from his childhood and just how broken she was. I can picture that night clearly because that was important information, because it explained not just my grandmother, it explained my father, who had to be raised in an environment to keep himself safe against that. And when I write journals, I'm not a great journal writer. I tend to do it on vacation. I write them with the knowledge that, Eric, be absolutely true in what you're writing, because one day your children are going to read these, and I'm going to let them. It's not appropriate yet. They don't need to know the fullness of things I wonder about or I'm scared of or anxious about. That's just, it's normal behavior, but they still depend on me to be this kind of safe and stable and anchored person. But there will come an age where it will be appropriate to understand more fully who their dad was, because it's their story too. So I think being a matriarch and a patriarch involves, with maturity and having a sense of when the season is right, of being the truth tellers so that the next generations could be raised with a broader understanding of who they are. So let's break there, break into your groups again. The question this time, it's in your notes, is, was there a matriarch or a patriarch in your family who lived out this power of blessing that I've been describing? Again, it might not be a grandparent, it could be an aunt or an uncle or someone, but someone who lived into this identity. All right, the Lord be with you. Let us resume our lectures together here. Exactly. All right, so this feels like a bit of an abrupt transition, but moving from our living families as a posture of faith relationship, it's actually not a far step to say that the next thing to discuss is prayer. Because if we love our grandkids, our nieces and nephews or whatnot, of course we're praying for them. And prayer is an essential part to our spirituality. I'm going to argue it's about the most essential part. And so it's the next thing to talk about. We've only got about 12 minutes, so I'm going to do my best to stay within it. Let me first say, I've never heard of a single person who would say that they have a good prayer life. Be at peace, right? And honestly, I think this is reasonable because we have been formed as physical creatures to engage in this world through our five senses. Like everything about the way we're used to interacting and being in relationship is based on the senses, and prayer is taking us beyond those five senses. So in many ways, it is not natural to us, and it seems confusing and frustrating, and you don't really know what you're doing. And I'm not going to tell you how to do it precisely either. My spiritual director, I started seeing her about 8 years ago, and all I wanted was for Monica to tell me how to pray. I'm the rector. I'm responsible for everything in the church. You just be responsible for me. Just tell me to do morning prayer every day, and I'll do it, so I could report back to you. She wouldn't do it. She said, Eric, you've got to figure out how to pray yourself. But she's right. And the reason is because prayer at its essence is you relating with God. And there's no one else who can tell you how to do that. There are wise practitioners. I have opinions I'm about to share, but at the end of the day, it's your relationship with God. And I believe that developing your life of prayer is one of the most significant things you could do in preparation for the late stage of living. We know that in this life, most of us will gradually lose relationships, we'll lose jobs, we'll lose our physical freedom, we will lose our memories. Much of the late season of life is more and more isolating. But if you have actually fostered a sense of prayer as being with God, you aren't isolated at all. If you are in God and God is in you, if God is in Carol and Carol is in God and God is in me, then I am with Carol. God is the unifying force to all existence. And the more and more deeply we have actually fostered a real sensibility of being with God, when we reach that late season of life, whatever that path looks like, we have everything. It reminds me of taking communion. I often think, when I look at this little wafer, Christ, if you are in this wafer, and you are everywhere in this world, if all the world is in you, then the whole world is in this wafer, and I'm getting ready to put it in me. It becomes this powerful moment of absolute oneness. And when you enter into that spirit of oneness, it is always a place of peace and wholeness and shalom, which I think is the heart of the kingdom of God as Jesus showed it to us. And so what we are doing in prayer is we're entering into union with God and with everything. And none of us know what we're doing. None of us know what we're doing. But I am increasingly believing that, God names himself as the I am, right? Like the essential sense of who God is the one of essential existence. And if that's who God is, then God is perpetually relevant, perpetually necessary. And regardless of our life circumstances, God is there. So I'm going to tell you 3 categories of prayer that have become important to me. Take these for what they're worth. Like I say, this is just where I am at age 51 on prayer. The first thing I've discovered in prayer is the freedom to be honest. There's a sense in which I regard God as kind of the divine eavesdropper. There's nothing that God isn't privy to inside me. So there's no use trying to impress God or shield God from everything. I take it as given that God knows it all, and so that I can be totally honest. I don't have to filter my thoughts or emotions to be acceptable for the divine. I just need to be honest. And if God is truth, and then truth is the only real way I could connect with God, so I might as well just be true about how I feel. When I got the news about the shootings yesterday, I was pissed. I was furious, not just at the shooter, but what's happening in our country and the culture of our country. My prayers didn't really get beyond that anger. I came home and Cynthia wanted to talk about it, and I went, no, I'm not ready. I can't talk, I'm just mad. But it was a prayer as well. And I think you'll find it's quite freeing if you realize I can be honest with God. If you've ever paid attention to the book of Psalms at all, there's far more people mad than happy. And it's actually prayer, and it's been encoded in Judeo-Christian worship for thousands of years, almost as permission. Please be honest. I was talking with a widow recently who doesn't have a prayer life at all, and we were exploring what prayer could mean. And she really didn't know, and all I did was parrot back to her. I wrote down everything I'd been hearing from her during our conversation. I just wrote it down, "Dear God," and I listed all the things I'd heard, and then wrote Amen. I said, "This is a real prayer." And she read it, and she said, "That's the most honest prayer I've ever prayed. I'm going to pray it every day." All it was giving her permission to be honest. I had a great story here, but I'm going to skip it for the sake of time. Suckers. Okay. But it begs the question, if God is an eavesdropper, if God knows it all anyway, what's the point of praying it? What's the point of being honest? It's not news to God. And that brings us to the second point, and it's we are not alone. I think as human creatures, for whatever reason, we live with a rather existential sense of loneliness, of this not being known. Even in the healthiest of relationships, the healthiest of marriages, there's always remains a bit of how we are not known and how you do not know the other. We are such complex beings. Like we were talking about everything in our life merging together to create Eric. I certainly don't know who I am fully, but part of what happens as I'm entering into prayer with this just absolute honesty with God is it's reversing this sense of aloneness. I'm not alone. God is the eavesdropper. God is the one to whom I am sharing these feelings, means I am not alone. And just as we talked about the Matriarch and Patriarch being the ones who bless, my perception of God is increasingly the one who blesses. That when I am with that God, and regardless of my circumstances, I'm not alone. If you picture a dry sponge being set on a water and the way that water just saturates it, it's a picture for me of God's presence in this world. Like everything in this world is saturated into God, and I'm a part of that. I am not alone, but drawn into God and God into me. And I'm even mindful of Jesus, something he might be modeling for us on the cross. In his total despair, what is it he prays out to God? My God, why have you forsaken me? Consider how different that is than had Jesus been on the cross and said, I am alone. Like even in claiming forsakenness, he's addressing it to God. That sense of being totally abandoned, he's still addressing the one who hears him, which means at some elemental level, there's this sense of knowledge, I'm not totally forsaken if there's still someone to hear my cry. And as I think on these things, I find what it's doing for me, it's I am beginning to increasingly trust the reliability of God in all things. In the shooting yesterday, yes, I'm angry at many things. But what I am not is despairing that God is not present to it. I'm not saying God approves of it, but God is present to it. There is no place where God is not. So it's true for the child who's being killed that God has never left that child. And our hope now is that child is in glory. But for me, watching it from a distance, God has not become absent because I trust that in all things God is. That there is no such thing as estrangement from the God who is. I do find myself relying on that language more and more. You know, when God names himself as the I am, sometimes prayer is simply now for me, you are. Just you are. And in saying that, I'm just affirming the absolute reality of God in all things. And sometimes it will shift to I am. Meaning, as you are, I am too. I am also having a life. I am also with you who are. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but I find it very assuring that in prayer I am entering always into existence with, that I am not alone. And for many, entering into this sense of kind of withness with God, it leads to silence. You know, there's just kind of, I am simply being with you. And there's a whole method of prayer called centering prayer, which is a practice of simply being silent with God. In fact, you are not being silent in order to hear God more clearly. There's some story about if Mother Mary should come in and give me a vision during my time of centering prayer, I'd say, not now, Mother Mary. I'm being silent. I am not a practitioner of centering prayer. I think I have some sensibility in that direction. I've just never been to a workshop and never read a book. But I know many people who have found centering prayer to be life-changing in their experience of prayer. Centering prayer, I'll read a description of it. To encounter those deeper reaches of our being, where our own life is constantly flowing out of and back into the divine life, what first seems to be needed is some sort of an interior on-off switch to tone down the inner talking as well. It's very simple. You sit either in a chair or on a prayer stool or mat, and allow your heart to open towards that invisible but always present origin of all that exists. Whenever a thought comes into your mind, you simply let the thought go and return. That open, silent attending upon the depths. Not because thinking is bad, but because it pulls you back to the surface of yourself. You use a sort of word or phrase known as a sacred word, such as Abba, Jesus' own word for God, or peace, or be still, to help you let go of the thought promptly and cleanly. You do this practice for 20 minutes, a bit longer if you'd like, then you simply get up and move on with your life. She says, you don't necessarily even have to be aware of what's happening. It's the mycelium. There is this sense of, in centering prayer, you are just opening yourself up to that sense of being with the God who is. And you trust that if that is the deeper reality of ourselves, there is profound work happening in the silence. St. John of the Cross, a 16th century Catholic mystic, said, silence is God's first language. If this has any appeal to you, I've given you 2 books by Cynthia Bourgeault. She's one of the strongest proponents and teachers on centering prayer. She's actually an Episcopal priest. Her writing style is quite accessible. You might start with the first book, Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening.
Is that similar or the same as contemplative prayer?
It is a form of contemplative prayer, but it has some definite practices. Yeah. Carol?
Well, that's the basis of all true meditation, whether it be the Buddhist meditations or even the martial arts meditations.
Right, yeah.
Let go of everything and focus on
Yeah, a lot of wisdom traditions have a contemplative practice that's akin to this. Cynthia Bourgeault would argue that there is a distinctly Christian thing happening in centering prayer, but many non-Christians could read the same book and find it to be very useful. Yeah, Carol?
Father Thomas Keating
Yes.
wrote, the first book I ever encountered that had to do with contemplative prayer. I didn't know there was a Christian tradition. I thought it was all Buddhist. And it's called Open Mind, Open Heart. And he goes through and gives you a whole series of very simple exercises on how to begin to practice centered prayer.
Yeah, Thomas Keating, he actually precedes Cynthia Bourgeault as kind of the Christian voice bringing this methodology into kind of the 20th century Western world. Cynthia, I recommend simply because there's something, she's quite accessible and she's an Episcopalian, and there's something about the language that just is quite accessible. But Thomas Keating as well. If you are interested in this, tell Linda Kalbum, not because she's an expert on this, but she's the head of the adult spiritual formation, and if there is a group of people who wanted to expose themselves to centering prayer and see if we could develop that in here, we could probably find a way to make that happen. Okay? So first, be honest. Second, in prayer, we are not alone. And the third and final point is the idea that in prayer, we are partnering with God. That if God is one, this idea of the Trinity, and we are made in God's image, this sense of union is essential to our sense of self. And as God is at work in this world, in prayer, it is a legitimate way that we are now partnering with what God is doing. And our role matters. Obviously, God could do whatever God wants to do with or without us. But I think what we're discovering more and more is that God made us, and we are made to be one with God, which is not just this ontological sense of being, but it's also just a partner in spirit. And that in prayer, if God is in everyone, loving everyone, and we enter consciously into God's presence in prayer, we become partners with what God is doing. And what do we trust that God is doing? God is loving, God is blessing, God is sustaining, God is forgiving, God is showing mercy. All these values of God that we see through Christ is what God is about. And when I enter into prayer, we're now entering into the realm of kind of intercession when we're praying on behalf of other people. I used to have very lengthy prayers telling God exactly how to solve someone's problem. I've basically just dropped it. I don't have enough wisdom to tell God how to function in this world. All I have is the desire of what I want. I could be honest with my desire, but increasingly, I just hold somebody in love with God. Sometimes it's brief. I sit in the first pew when I come to work each morning, and I just hold whichever person I'm thinking of. Largely church people, my family. God, Jeff, and Gail. And there is just this moment when I am with God, loving them. God doesn't stop. God does it perpetually. But in that moment, as I hold that person, I am now a partner with God. I think that's part of the value of those votive candles. When you light a votive candle when you're at church on Sunday, it's often your heart is praying for someone. And then you go on and you've got to make dinner and get the clothes. You can't stay in that space of attentiveness. But when you light the candle, there's a sense that candle's going to burn all day. My prayer is going to remain with God, who is always loving that person. When that candle extinguishes, the one above it that we're having trouble with, because it's now an oil candle that's having trouble staying lit, symbolically, it says that big candle absorbs all the little candles, and it just keeps on burning. And it's this idea that God is always loving, and we enter in for a moment. And I pray for the person's good. That's just it. I just pray for their good. I was not a fan of President Trump. I prayed for his good all the time, almost every day when he was president, and I meant it. I really did. I would hold him with compassion, and I believe God loves him as well. I've started praying for Putin. I think what he's doing is totally evil. I don't want Putin to succeed. But if he's functioning out of some kind of evil, broken madness, he most of all is to be pitied. And if Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and the last shall be first, and the first shall be last, I believe that's where God is loving. And if I want to be one with God, I want to do what God is doing. So I just hold Putin and pray for his good, and let God work out what that means.
How do you hold beyond that and kill all Trinity?
In the same way. The young man who killed all those children was clearly a terribly broken person. Terribly. He is not living in to the Imago Dei. It's the reverse. Who needs mercy? Carol? Yeah, his parents too. Absolutely.
But especially the parents of the perpetrator, they can guilt that they feel whether or not they're convicted.
Yep.
His
Yep.
grandmother, there's something, his poor grandmother, right?
Yep.
If she survived, the grandmother.
Yep. Yep. I just have to trust that God loves them and that God is in their life too. And especially in an era of such division, it's my soul needs to enter into God's heart of loving them. And the other thing I've found is that what it does, it helps heal us. If there's an area, I'm not going to go there. One other thing before it's time to end for the day is there's a way in which praying for an individual becomes like an icon. An icon isn't just a painting, it's religious art. What an icon is, it's a method of prayer that becomes like a veil into the mystery of what is beyond. And sometimes what you can do is you pray for an individual as a representative of the whole. In our finite humanness, I can't conjure up a passion for all of humanity, but I know how to love one. And so sometimes when we're praying for the one, they represent the whole. I'm going to recommend to you, for all of us who lit one of these candles on behalf of one of the kids who died, pretty soon a list will come out for all the victims. We don't know them. You might just choose one of those names. It can be the candle you lit, and say for the next month, I'm going to pray for that child and their family individually. There's something about naming the particular that becomes an icon to the whole that we in our humanness can handle. And so a little girl named Rosa, she's going to become yours to pray for, and her family. And every day, even if all you're doing, just cupping your hands and saying your name, that's entering into the heart of God. And in so doing, we're reversing the pain of this world that wants to hate, this world that wants to divide, this world that wants to be fearful. You gather Rosa, and you hold her in love, and trust that that's where God is. And she's now become your icon to being with God in peace and love, instead of giving yourself over to the hatred of this world. So let's end it right there. It's now 2:10, so I've gone over. So we'll forgo the last discussion question. And we'll see you here next week at 12:30. Thank you, everyone.